This month's guest is Russ Heddleston, a three-time founder, best known as the co-founder and former CEO of DocSend, a powerful document sharing platform that was acquired by Dropbox in 2021 for an impressive $165 million after raising less than $15 million in total funding. Before DocSend, Russ co-founded Pursuit, a social referral company designed to help source referral candidates, which was successfully sold to Meta in 2011. During his time at Meta, Russ ran product management for the Pages product. Russ's academic credentials are equally impressive. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, in addition to a master's in computer science and a bachelor's in computer engineering from Stanford University. His professional journey includes significant roles in product and management at leading companies like Microsoft, Trulia, Greystripe, and of course, DocSend and Dropbox. Today, Russ is working on a new venture called Distill, which uses AI to deliver tailored, in-depth reports on individuals and companies in an instant. I may have used Distill to distill Russ's bio. So join us as we dive into Russ's entrepreneurial journey in conversation with Scuda Management's founder and managing partner, Olive Shaw. Please give a warm round of applause to our guest.
Russ, would love to just explain to folks what DocSend was then, and then we can talk about kind of what it both into.
Yeah, so for my master's, I did human-computer interaction at Stanford, and that was like the fluffy one, and the cool masters would have been like compilers or operating systems or AI, and HCI was like the designy one. But my theory has always been most things can be built, they just shouldn't be built, or they're the wrong thing to be built. And so for DocSend, Dave and Tony really wanted to build a product for the end user, like something that we would use, like people we know would use, that would be not like an enterprisey thing. And so the original idea with it was very simple. I had interned at Dropbox while I was in business school, and that had gotten rid of the need to send myself an attachment, but this is so long ago, it's like 2010, right? So, but people were still sending other people attachments. And so we just did a lot of interviewing, like, why are people still emailing attachments when there are just so many ways to not send an attachment? And so that was the hypothesis, or that was the question. And the hypothesis was, if we can make it really easy to send a link and not an attachment, and we can add enough value to the sender and make it easy on the recipient side to go through that, then we can just change behavior. And we just wanted this product to exist. And so that was the thought experiment. And we thought it would be totally viral. And we thought that document analytics would be the hook that would get everyone in. And it was nice. It actually did matter a lot in the end. But yeah, that was the first thesis, was like really easy link sending with great analytics on top of it for sending documents.
Yeah, it seems like such an obvious insight. Obviously, you guys were lucky to get there first, and obviously a lot of thinking went into that. But I think was it 2013, 2014 when you launched?
We started in March of 2013, and then we launched it in 2014 at TechCrunch Disrupt in New York.
Right, and so I remember in 2014, as somebody who was raising capital and also as a venture investor investing in with businesses, that I think within 6 months. Obviously, there were a bunch of other markets that were tracking, but the one that immediately popped was DocSend became the industry standard in how you would send on a deck to be viewed, for the simple reason that as the sender, you knew exactly how much time was spent on each page, who viewed it, and how far through the deck they got. And through that, it was very easy within just a 2-second snapshot of viewing to understand, hey, this person is really engaged. And it's a real prospect for investing, and this person is not engaged. Like, oh, look, this person forwarded to 3 other people on their team, and this is a really good prospect, and we should really dig in here. I know there were a bunch of other markets where that also happened, but VC was really where it went viral. Curious if there was anything that you guys did to shape that, or that was just kind of what happened.
Well, we started there because we knew that, and so actually, one of the first things I did with it when we were raising for DocSend was there's no marketing site. No one knew what the product was. And so I sent the link to a VC, and it was a DocSend link, and it was our deck. And the first page was the team, and we were a good team. We're all like Stanford software engineers and good track records. And then the rest of it explained what DocSend, the product, was. And the first person read the deck, but they only read the the team page. They didn't actually read the rest of the deck. And they responded to me saying, I love what you're working on. I can't wait to learn more. Which is funny to me because I'm like, there's just no way on earth that you know what we're working on. So I just caught you in a lie. And not that it mattered especially. They did forward it to their colleague, and then I did meet with that person, and then we had a good laugh about it. And then they did not invest, so maybe that person was like, oh, this is embarrassing. I don't know if I got back to them or something. But it was funny how like immediately that happened. And so pitch decks were always a good use case for it. In the interviews we did to make sure it's something we wanted to go do, we did talk to a lot of different use cases, and they're all external facing B2B roles. So like sales, account management, recruiting, anything like real estate was also a pretty common one. People just send a lot of documents for work stuff. But yeah, pitch decks were a really good use case from the very get-go. Our first revenue, if we can count it, was basically a friend of mine who we were trading DocSend accounts for feedback. And someone gave us a bottle of whiskey after they raised money for their company using DocSend. And I was like, does this count as revenue? I'm like, maybe, sure. So, and then we did a lot of other things. And then, but yeah, we didn't actually brand DocSend for fundraising because it was too small of a market. Like I did some math and it was like, okay, maybe 65 million a year as the TAM, which is way too small. So we did work on it for a lot of other verticals over time, but yeah, fundraising was always strong. And then we just finally leaned into it after a few years. We actually published a bunch of research reports on fundraising and how it works for pre-seed and seed and beyond. And that was really great for top of funnel because there's also the other characteristic we didn't appreciate at first, which is that founders will just give it to their sales team. They'll just give it to other people. And then VCs would start using it. And then certainly financial services would start using it. And so suddenly like actually did spread pretty well. Even though we weren't branding it for these other use cases, it just started in one spot and then people found great utility for it elsewhere.
Yeah, there's an interesting lesson there around just leveraging yourself to startups is generally a great way to grow because startups take in a lot of capital, they hire a lot of people, they push all these products and people that they hire, and then the velocity of those people going to other places, other startups, other large corporations. It's kind of a consistent thing. And so if you can insert yourself to the sort of locus of a startup, which is the CEO who's doing fundraising, then the amount of virality that you're going to drive to everyone else, which makes a ton of sense. That's really fascinating. So, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say that, the startups are very tiny as a market. Also not great and in our favor in the early days is that it's almost like dating in the sense that if the product does its job well, it ends. The person raises money and it's episodic. So like, we loved it. And then they're just gone. And they're like, come back. And like, well, I don't need it. I'll come back in like 2 years for my next round of fundraising. So it was episodic and that was really not great, but the fit was really high. And so we did see people like recommending it, even though there was this like very choppy usage pattern. But over time, we were actually able to smooth that out and have people use it for investor relations and just make it like a Swiss Army knife, starting with that one use case.
Makes sense. So obviously, shameless plug to founders. Definitely use DocSend if you're not already. Fast forwarding, I don't know if it was a year or 2 years, you had a great amount of traction in that fundraising market. And then it sounds like you also had a much more nascent sort of business that was more of an enterprise sales motion for sales enablement. Would love to sort of set the stage for folks in terms of how you thought about those two markets that struck your investors at the time, and what led you to say, hey, we want to go more after the sales enablement market, the enterprise sales motion, when you had a working motion and a more self-serve approach.
Yeah, and I think in hindsight, I can make everything sound better than it felt at the time. And like it made sense, even though at the time I was like, oh no, like I'm not sure any of this is going to work. But when we launched it at TechCrunch Disrupt, there was a big spike and went down. And we were like, it's going to go like this. And it was like linear. And we were like, uh-oh, linear is like not zero, but it's like not good enough. And so it's somewhere in the middle. And you're like, I don't know what to do with that. And so we put in a paid plan and like $10 a month. Some people started paying for it. That was fine. But our investors, just the seed round, we raised like 1.7 million for the seed round. They were like, you guys got to grow faster. You got to grow revenue faster. And so I was looking in our user base to be like, who will pay more money for this? And so I sold a couple like $50K a year deals, which at the time was like a lot of money. And so then our investors were like, do that, just do a lot more of that. So we had this kind of self-serve business that was slow, but kind of like sleepy. And we couldn't get it to do this, but so we weren't sure to do. So we started selling up market. We raised an $8 million Series A, which was great. I'm glad that we did. I'm not sure we deserved it at the time, but they had a lot of faith that we'd figured out, which we
They were specifically investing in that enterprise sales motion for sales enablement.
No, oddly. They were just investing in us as a team, being like, we think you're going to figure it out later, which we did. They actually told me, they're like, we're not sure about the sales thing, but we'll let you do whatever it is you think you'd like to do. And so, yeah, they ended up being right about that. But it was self-serve. The first version of our website just said document analytics, which no one has ever really looked for. But like, it did describe what the product did. And then we morphed it to sales enablement, which was just very broad and general. And we were selling upmarket into big sales teams. And it worked somewhat, but it was slow. It was expensive. I hired a whole team of like 12 salespeople. And I've never been in sales before. So I was suddenly a sales manager, and we figured it out as it went. But, this is some of the building the airplane on the way down type of situation. And yeah, it was an interesting roller coaster when we were both managing the self-serve stuff and then trying to get the enterprise stuff working. And it was working, but slower than I was hoping. So it was interesting. There were basically three phases. There was our self-serve one. We then pivoted to enterprise or mid-market for 3 years. And then we were going to run out of money and die in 2018, but I didn't tell our team this. Like, generally, not a good idea to tell your team that things aren't going well. It's not like good to like be too rosy, but I was like, we need to figure out something here. And we were at like 4 million in ARR, and it was clear to me that like getting feedback from investors that it's going to be hard for us to raise money. Talk to some potential acquirers. It's going to be hard for anyone to acquire the business because it was half self-serve and it was half mid-market revenue, which is like kind of an odd mix. And so then the third phase is when, in a panic, I interviewed a ton of people, figured out what we were best at, rebranded it, at least our positioning, our pricing, our packaging, and went back to being a self-serve product that we marketed vertically. And that last one is where it actually really worked the best.
And so were there obviously there must have been hints of that earlier on. Like, what was the sort of the thinking that led you in one path and then brought you back to the other path?
Well, the thinking on the middle path, selling to sales, is that it's much easier to add revenue when you do it in big chunks. So we did sell 50K, 100K deals, and that was great because you can just stack them on top of each other and it feels really good. And then for self-serve stuff, it's like, man, how do we add like this many more like $10 a month plans?
And you couldn't just turn on marketing and get more of those.
We never figured out demand gen. We never spent we tried to spend money on demand gen, but no one was ever searching for document analytics. It's a product that once people learned about it and they started using it, they're like, this is amazing. And then they would refer other people. But throughout the entire history of the company, the number one channel was always word of mouth, just people typing in DocSend.com and signing up. So when we went back to the other one, it was more of like a desperation situation where it was like, this is too expensive. Why don't we go re-optimize the self-serve part of the product? And in interviewing all these customers, I actually learned a lot of things I didn't know before, just around where there was the most urgency and which people were using it the most. So I just go look at accounts. We had, like a few thousand users at that point, or customers. And so it was enough to like find people, like pockets of like high usage. And there was like an investment banker in Toronto who I was like talking to, and I'm asking him, how is he using it? And he says he sends it to his secretary, his documents. She sends him back the links. He sends the links out. She sends him screenshots of the usage of the decks. And he's selling businesses for, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so he loves the product and he thinks it's insane that it's free. And I'm like, oh, your secretary pays us $10 a month. And he's like I said, it's free. So I was like, uh-oh, I think that we're not really matching the value to like what we're charging here. So we made a big jump up from $10 a month to $150 a month, which for that banker is still free. But relative to where we were at before was a big difference. And that was fascinating. I call that message market fit, where we figured out what people cared the most about and were able to talk about that in language they understood. And so I thought that when we increased prices, our conversion would go down, but revenue would go up. We actually called it Project Couch Change. We were trying to add $50,000 in incremental net new ARR every quarter. And we just blew that out of the water. Conversion actually went up because a lot of people weren't paying for it because it was too cheap. It just like it couldn't be the thing they were looking for. It was too cheap. It's like if there's a sandwich and it's just a really, really cheap sandwich, at a certain point, you're going to look at it funny and be like, I don't know if I can trust this. And this is just like, this might not be what I'm looking for. And so conversion actually went up for a good chunk of the users that were coming to DocSend anyway. And so we left the $10 plan there. That was still there, but we just added a lot more security features, a lot more control features to that. And we just talked about them more. Like what we were already doing, we just talked about it in language where people are like, this is what I wanted. And so that change was just really magical to see.
That's really fascinating. And I think it highlights an interesting kind of generalized point, which is it's really hard for large companies to target multiple segments. It's virtually impossible for startups. You always have that temptation. I know we did it with Sentio, where there's a bunch of different large markets and TAMs, and the product kind of does what most of them need. And you're like, okay, I can build a product to touch all those things, and I can keep both those markets. But the thing that ends up mattering more than necessarily what the product can do is how it's marketed, how it's onboarded, what your markup says, what your website says in terms of who it's for. And it's really hard to convince people that, hey, this is both for sales enablement team and document analytics for fundraising and things like that. And the more of those things you put in, the more you can dilute your message for everyone of those parties. So I think that's a fascinating example of exactly that.
It's a little bit, I think it's hard to build your product for multiple ones because then you're diluting how good it is. But in our instance, we actually took the exact same product and just changed how we talked about it. And so we actually, without changing the product at all, just marketed it to different verticals. So I think you're probably right. It's better to go all in on one. But our experiment was like, it's the same thing. Why don't we just talk about it 6 different ways? And actually, by talking about it in terms that each of those people could understand, it's a bit like sell me this pen. Like you want to talk about like what it does, not what it is. And with that in mind, maybe our conversion was really low before, but it went up a lot from where it was at before. So that conversion was fascinating to me, like as an engineer, like the just power of branding, the power of messaging, the power of like describing it to someone in terms they can understand, like mattered so much for us.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think part of it is also, I'm sure you have those specific websites for each of the use cases, setting those so specifically there. But also it's something where it's really hard to do that initially. The bigger you get, then it's almost like, okay, let's find a niche vertical, really hammer that. And then once you get to a certain size, the product doesn't need to change, but it's more like the segmentation and the marketing to be able to go after more of those folks.
Totally. We also had this benefit of being a horizontal product where we just observed what people were doing with it and we interviewed them and then we put that up on our website. So it wasn't me just like coming up with something hopeful that like maybe they'll like it. It's like I talked to enough people, like CFOs, I'm like, I knew why they liked it. And then I could just put that back up on the marketing site. So it's fascinating that when we're 4 million ARRs, 2 of mid-market and 2 of self-serve. And then when we ended up selling it just a few years later, like less than 3, we're at a little over 15 million in ARR. And that was almost all that 2 million in self-serve, like rocketed up. And then like, we didn't fire our mid-market customers, they're great. But that part of the business like grew incrementally, but like the self-serve just like really took off. It was fascinating. We didn't change anything else. We weren't like dumping a ton of money into demand gen. We got to accidentally profitable. It was growing so fast. I don't think, to your point, we could have done that on day one. I think it took a while for us to figure out like what people are actually doing with it and to have enough data to then repeat back to them like what was true in reality.
Great. That's a great inflection. We'd love to understand kind of how you go from there to ultimately acquisition.
Well, different for absolutely every company. It's because the first company I'd say with Pursuit was very lucky happenstance that I was using our product, and so we were going to pivot anyway, and that one worked out well. It is a prior relationship. With selling DocSend, I did know Dropbox. I interned there in 2010, but when in 2018 I went around to like ask anyone to buy this thing, and everyone's like, nah, it's okay. So what happened a few years later was I got an inbound offer from another company that I'd talked to before, and I was like, hey, we're actually going to be more expensive now because we finally figured out a bunch of stuff. So I shared my numbers with them, and they're like, oh, dang, you are going to be more expensive. You did figure out things. And so I went to Dropbox. They came back with a slightly higher number, 165 million. We had a banker, but we didn't shop it around. I think in retrospect, I probably would. But we were just a very clean business in terms of like the ARR, how buttoned up we were around what our revenue was, where it was coming from. We were 65 people. And so it happened very fast. We could have raised at a lot higher valuation than 165 million. And we were finally like hitting an inflection point. And we were just before that. We sold in March of 21. And so we were negotiating it in Q1. And so we like right after that is when it went like really frothy. Yeah. Market timing is so funny. I don't know. Everyone was like very happy. Our investors, when we had that rough spot in 2018, what I was told is that like when startups do this, what investors in their heads do is they're like, you got it. But then secretly they're like, yeah, the company's totally screwed. They're not going to make it at all. Just going to put them down at zero, but be very kind to them. And, in the meantime, so when we got an offer, they were like thrilled. They're like, oh my God, we thought you were zero. This is great. So even though I was like, but it's finally working now, they just don't see that very often. So it was very reasonable. It was 11x ARR offer. We were profitable. We didn't need to sell. So it was fascinating that we weren't in a position where we had to do it, but we'd been at it for 8 years and it was pretty reasonable. And so we took the offer, but it was very straightforward. It wasn't hard. We weren't attempting to sell it. They were getting a great deal. They were getting it for like half off relative to what we could have like raised money at as a valuation. And so, yeah, it's kind of fascinating just how that one came together.
Makes sense. I guess the last question on DocSend before we move on to AI and still a little bit of colleagues. You were very early in what now is called product-led growth. The idea that you're not using a sales team and a marketing team to really push your product, but rather individuals can use the product, and from individuals using it, you can get a certain amount of virality and thus be much more effective in your spend. And ultimately, those are really great business if you can figure out how to drive product-led growth. So I think it's then become a discipline. You guys are one of the pioneers in that. So we'd love to just get some takes from you in terms of what it was that we did, think you had that allowed you to build a business that's successful and the capital plant that's it.
Yeah, it is true that at the time it wasn't a thing in like 2013 when we started. And we actually did a case study with Harvard Business School, one of the old professors there. And we did a failure case study, which is great because we took the moment in time in 2018 when things were not looking good, but we figured out a little bit of stuff. And then we're like, okay, we're not going to die, but like, what do we do with this thing, And so I sat in as a class was, discussing this amongst themselves and debating, and as the protagonist, I was there, kind of giving them details. But in my head, I was just like, oh my God, it's so hard to listen to because they're all like, well, obviously product-led growth, this, and this. Why didn't they see that? And I was like, it wasn't a thing back then. Like, no one knew. The prevailing advice at the time had nothing to do with this, and like people didn't think it was like possible for it to scale as far as it did. Because in the earnings call since Dropbox was sold, and Dropbox has been like so, since DocSend was sold to Dropbox has been so pleased with how well it's done because it's continued to do very well from them, just like on its baseline. But I think some of the parts of that came together to make it work really well is like a very simple product that just kind of is a tool on the surface that you can get into in a single player version, but it has enough depth to go into the corners because we added data rooms, we added e-signature, we added a lot of like features in there that are more power user features. And so sometimes people would come in for that, but sometimes they would just come in for like document tracking. So it was kind of fascinating how the thing always felt relatively easy to use and understand, but could become pretty complicated. You can integrate it into your marketing automation systems. We did CRM integrations. We did like a lot of like pretty advanced stuff in there. But it was very easy to understand the utility of any particular part of it and to go get started and put your credit card in and just like get a trial going. So I do think there's something to be said for ease of use, for clarity of messaging, or kind of verticalized messaging. Because when it says sales enablement, like no one's going to put in their credit card for $20,000, $50,000 on their own, right? Like what does it even mean? Whereas like DocSend was very specific. Like we do these exact things for you. So that sort of system, if you can get it set up from the get-go, doesn't need a lot of humans in it. And especially if the product has any sort of external facing anything, and DocSend links get sent everywhere. So there's a lot of external facing it does spread itself. Although ironically, word of mouth was always bigger than like direct virality. Like more people came to it from just being told about it than from getting DocSend links. So yeah, I think those things together combined with really good content marketing just meant we never had to spend money on marketing. I wish we could have, but we never found a way to do it. But yeah, we always had 100% inbound and 95% self-serve like revenue growth for the company, which was awesome. I will say one downside of that, if it can be called a downside, is that if you're talking to investors, they want to sell you money. And so they want to hear like, hey, if I give you another $20 million, how much money are you going to turn that into? And for a product-led growth company, it's like, I don't know. All I can tell you is if we do these things, we unblock users, good things will happen. Like, but how many good things, And so it's like kind of hard to answer to until like you just see this, it starts to hockey stick. So it's not deterministic, but it is very efficient. And now I think that we have more examples of it. It's more common as like a path to go down.
One follow-up question there that you brought up, which I think for everyone who's raising and trying to position their business, is around TAM. Love to understand kind of how you thought about TAM early on. what you heard from feedback from investors around kind of the issues around TAM and how that drove, some of the evolution, like where you started.
Yeah, TAM's a tough one because it varies depending who you talk to, how much they care about it. And certainly, yeah, most VCs are like, oh, it's got to be giant TAM. I think especially for workflow software, and especially if you're product led, I actually don't care as much about TAM here talking to a founder. I care more about the relevancy of the workflow and how many situations. Is the TAM for something like a Notion, or an Airtable? Conceivably like very small, but they just put together a lot of them because it's the same workflow across them all. So especially when I talk to founders, like I always tell them, I've never seen a founder get to 10 million in ARR and then just be like, that's the whole TAM, and we're just totally out of ideas. We have no idea what to do now with the company. Like I almost always see people say, this is a giant TAM, it's huge, and then they just never even get to 1 million in ARR. And so, I would much prefer that the team, and certainly for myself, is like aim narrow and hit that, and then look at what are the adjacencies. Because in DocSend's example, like we, after doing the very simple document tracking stuff, like e-signature, a couple billion a year in annual spend, like data rooms, a couple billion in annual spend. Like we had a lot of like big TAMs ahead of us that we can move into if we wanted to, and so things can evolve over time. So I don't think it's wrong to push a founder or as the founder to think through like what could this be later. Like just paint the picture of like, if it went really well, how big could it conceivably be? But then with your team, I think it's better to just be very specific, being like, okay, but for our beachhead, we're going to go after this like pretty narrow thing, just to make sure, we get from 0 to 1.
Absolutely. I think that's my approach too, is if you can find a narrow TAM, kill it, own that customer wallet share, the more trust you have with those customers, there are always adjacent things that are new categories as well as other categories you're spending with your competitors. And so it's not to say you shouldn't start out with big TAMs, and big TAMs are obviously better than smaller TAMs, but generally, if you do hear that as feedback, it's not really a turn off for everyone, and it's more like you just have to figure out how to turn your TAM into larger and larger TAMs, because ultimately you're building a relationship with customers. The more they trust you, the better your software is, the more it makes their life easier, the more opportunity you're going to have to continue to grow the TAM.
Another funny thing to me is just how you can just switch out your marketing site and no one cares. Because the people who are already using your product are using your product every day. They don't actually look at your marketing site anymore. So when we started off as document analytics, then we switched it to sales enablement, we had a lot of people who kept coming to us being like, are you the service that does blah, blah, blah? And then support would be like, yes, we are. They'd be like, cool. And then you just put in their credit card. And then when we switched it again, like every time we just switch up our marketing site, like no one cared. Like people were just like trying to figure out what we did. And so you have a lot of opportunity as a company. Your product itself has a lot of inertia, like that's hard to change your code base, but the way you talk about your product can be changed like pretty easily for the new people. So it allows you to experiment with what other markets you can get into, and you just have a lot of freedom and latitude to mess around with your marketing over time. So that allows you to go narrow at first and then expand your marketing and to a bigger group later.
Makes sense. So I'd love to move on to Distill, your current startup. I think maybe the same sort of discussion around your process, how you narrowed it down, versus all of the things you were thinking about, and then we can kind of talk about what you do with Distill.
Yeah, so after selling to Dropbox, which was it's great, 8 years in, a long journey, we integrated a Dropbox, and then I went and traveled. My wife and I traveled for a year, which was super fun. And then I was thinking, I'm just kind of bored. I would like another project of some sort. My wife's like, learned to play the guitar, and I was like, I don't know. And as I thought through, I looked at actually being a VC. I interviewed at a bunch of VC firms, and I was like, I don't know if I really want to be the VC role. It's needed in the ecosystem, but I like to build a product that's fun for me. I looked at being the CEO at someone else's company because suddenly the way we ran DocSend was really in vogue in like 2022, 2023, because everyone raised a ton of money, and then everyone's like, uh-oh, but they need to make a business out of it now. And so they're like, you ran a profitable startup. How did you do that? Do that for our company. And then I was like, I don't really want to run someone else's. I thought of it as making someone else's PowerPoint into a real company, and then that didn't seem very compelling to me. So my other co-founders were on great terms. They're still retired for now. I think they're gonna get bored later, but I found a new co-founder last year, and we spent all of last year basically just playing around with LLMs. So like me, he likes targeting the end user, not the economic buyer, but we both like B2B. And we wanted to use LLMs because that's totally new and no one has any idea. So from like a new footing perspective, it's like, no one has any idea. Therefore, we could be just as good or better than anyone else. So we for DocSend spent 4 months, and for Distill we spent almost a year actually going and playing around with different ideas, building software, building prototypes, and I'm glad that we did. But my co-founder Tim, it's also his third company, so he's also been around the block with this a couple times, and for both of us, we're like, it's funny because we both expressed this as, we want to be really lazy with this company. And what that meant was like, we want something that's just like easy to explain and has these properties that will just hopefully let it spread itself later on down the road. Because enterprise sales is like it just is always work. It's work at the beginning, it's work later, and it just gets more complex the bigger you get. And so ironically, in trying to be lazy, it takes a lot more work up front as you go through and kick the tires on various ideas. So yeah, we got to the idea for Distill, which as Johnny was saying is like a Wikipedia for everyone else. It's like, can we just take AI and make profiles on people and companies, kind of like search, but if you had search just for people and companies, it wouldn't be a bunch of blue links, it would be profiles. It'd be like little Wikipedia pages. So can we just build that into a product? And so we kept poking at it from a lot of different angles, and just like DocSend, like we couldn't convince ourselves it was a bad idea. So at a certain point, we just decided to start building it out.
That's exciting. And how do you think about your competitive landscape today and where you think it's going to go?
It's fascinating with DocSend that even though we were, never a very, big company, we had so many competitors, both copycats as well as big companies attempting to squash us. We had multiple like public companies buy a competitor and tell me like, we're going to kill you. And I'm like, you're so much bigger than us. You have much better things to do than like, and then any startup attempting to clone us. I'm like, please go clone a larger, more successful company. This is just too small to deal with. I mean, what I learned out of that, though, is that you're kind of running your own race because none of those things ever impacted us. They didn't matter at all. And with Dropbox, there was some concern that they were just going to build it out themselves and then be on the other side of that. I'm like, I don't think that was a real concern. And so for this company, yeah, Tim and I have just also had the mindset that we just need to talk to users, solve problems, build a great product, and kind of run our own race, which really does. I'm very curious about what other companies are doing, but I'm not that afraid of it, I guess, is the difference.
It's generally the case, right? If you can execute yourself, there's always enough TAM there. But, you can always be looking left and right, and there's a huge element of, just looking at TechCrunch, what are people writing about, like what are your competitors doing, but ultimately, it's just up to you to execute, and the rest kind of takes care of itself.
Yeah, and I also like to think, at least for me, it's very motivating to have like something about the future state of the world that just needs to be true. Otherwise, like it's just insane if it doesn't happen. And so for DocSend, I was like, it would just be insane if in the future people are still sending everyone like Keynote attachments, but on the other end, they like don't have a way to open the Keynote attachment, or like these like huge PowerPoint files that just don't make it into anyone's inbox. And like, it's just, I know it's still happening. We didn't quite make our mission successful all the way, but that's still something that, even when things weren't going well with DocSend, I was like, this is worth solving, like this thing. And so, yeah, it's kind of the same for Distill, where it's like, yeah, it would be really nice if there's just a summary of people and companies somewhere. So it's really nice to have that kind of level of like, this should just really exist in the world, belief to like go after and build it out. And it actually did help me. With DocSend as well, we went around and asked everyone who should build it, like, hey, why aren't you going to build this? Like, you should build this. And then the conversations I had were fascinating because sometimes people do like, oh, we'll build it in 2 years. And I was like, that means you're never going to build it. And so same for Distill. I went around like, someone should build this. And then we talked to people and everyone's like, well, maybe later. And I'm like, I don't think that's going to be true. And when we get to the question, like, why wouldn't Google build this? If Google wanted to build anything, they could. And so there's never a good like actual defense against that, at least at the beginning. But it's just empirically the case that they probably won't. And so we don't spend that much time worrying about it.
Much bigger problems right now.
They do. Yeah.
And last question, I'd love to get your take on sort of the capabilities and kind of the limits of what LLMs can do. You've obviously spent a lot of time over the last 18 months with them and trying to use them and productize them in a way where, that is the core filter through which you're taking data, processing it, and turning it into insight. And so, I'm sure a lot of folks in this room are working with LLMs and are thinking about it. I'm sure you have a lot of insights. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, it's been so much fun. One of my mom's friends would asking me like, what do the LLMs do? And I was like, wow, you know that vocab word. I'm so impressed. And they can do anything. I was like, imagine you have unlimited third graders that can just do whatever you want. And they're like, is that helpful? And I was like, that's a great question. Like, is it? And they're getting better in the last year, but it's still the smartest thing, the dumbest thing at the same time. I had someone else tell me that it's like an alien technology was dropped here and we're just poking at it, trying to figure out what can you do with it. I will say that it was pretty hard last year to think through ideas that are possible only with LLMs, but are also not things that a big company is just going to do that's right adjacent to them.
That was one of your filters that you wanted.
Yeah. So when you say like, do you worry about competition? The answer is not really, because we already sussed out a lot of like who should do what. And so for other ideas, like, yeah, I was like, this big company is totally going to add this feature to their thing, and then this is going to be really irrelevant. And so like that happens a lot. With this particular one, I'm not that concerned about it. But yeah, it's hard to find something that's a good use for LLMs that's not purely a chatbot type of thing. So I think a lot of the good use cases are one step removed. And part of the motivation for Tim and I like starting another company is that we kept seeing all this hype around LLMs, and everyone was like losing their mind 2 years ago around like GPT and ChatGPT and LLMs. And then I was like, okay, cool. Now what? Like, any cool applications? Anyone doing anything different? And the answer is like, no. Like, other than ChatGPT, it's like still most people aren't doing that much different. So that's part of what sparked our journey to try to go make use of them and do something really cool with them. So I hope there are a lot of other applications coming that'll be mind-blowing, but yeah, it was surprising to me how hard it was to get them to do something useful where the hallucinations didn't matter, where it was okay that it was non-deterministic, where there's some tolerance to it, but it's still like very useful for solving something.
So for what you're prototyping today, how do you sort of break down at a really high level without getting this into the secret sauce, like things that LLMs are doing versus things that you need humans or some other more traditional software to do?
It varies. I'd say for what we're doing with Distill, like one of the core like insights we've got around like what LLMs can help us with is just like the entity disambiguation problem, which is something I was working on at Meta tangentially. And like which olive is this? And it's like it's actually very hard to know. Like when you're Googling for it, and if you have a unique name, that's fine, but common name, not fine. Also, company names like Anvil. There are like 20 different Anvil companies. Like which one are we talking about here? So you're actually trying to do that human task of like doing any research. That disambiguation is oddly hard. And so it's not as simple as just chucking a bunch of stuff into the context window and just asking one question. We're actually doing a lot of sleuthing. We're actually building up a case on the back end. So it is actually unintuitive how we're using LLMs to solve the entity disambiguation problem. But for me, if we, that's a good use case for them. And that actually unlocks some really cool, unintuitive things. And so that's like the type of problem set where when I talk to founders about, is this a good use case for whatever they're using LLMs for, I'm usually looking for that like kind of unintuitive insight of what they can do that's one step removed. That's not just chatbot for X, like that sort of direct thing. Those are the sorts of things where I'm like, that doesn't feel as defensible to me.
Great, thank you.